I think we should begin, Robert. So,
Good, thank
would
you.
you like to introduce our very special guest?
Certainly, thank you. Good evening. I'm Robert Goot, Deputy President of the ECAJ, and in the absence of Gillian Siegel, AO, our President, who is overseas and apologises, I'll be chairing this evening's webinar, the Voice Referendum with Noel Pearson. Noel Pearson will address us shortly, and then we'll answer questions which can be submitted via the chat function, and the questions will be, not by the chat function, thank you, by the number that is on the screen, and they'll be moderated by Peter Wertheim, the co-CEO of the ECAJ. Just a warning, this event must finish no later than 7 p.m. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we who are in Sydney gather, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, as well as to their emerging leaders. I record with great sadness the passing earlier today of Jeremy Jones, amongst other things, a former president and honorary life member of the ECAJ, and a great and public supporter of Indigenous Australians. Jeremy always wore a kippa, and one of his many endearing qualities was to invariably wear one covered with Aboriginal art. We shall sorely miss him. May his memory be a blessing. Friends, I welcome you all, and in particular, I welcome our guest presenter, Noel Pearson. Noel Pearson is a lawyer and founder of the Cape York Partnership and the founder of Good to Great Schools Australia. He is a renowned advocate and activist for over 30 years for Indigenous Australians' rights to land and for changes in direction to Indigenous policies in relation to welfare, substance abuse, child protection, education, and economic development. He is a considered thinker, accomplished author, and an eloquent orator. It would be remiss of me not to mention Noel's deep admiration for what he describes as the Jewish model of perseverance, dedication, and success that it represents, which he has described as a beacon and a model for his own thinking about the predicament of Indigenous Australians and how it is that we might turn our powerless lot around. Noel has readily acknowledged learning two important lessons from the Jewish community. Firstly, the imperative to be vigilant against racism, and secondly, that whilst the Jewish people have long been victimised, they have never succumbed to victimhood. Noel Pearson was at the forefront of the movement that in 2017 delivered the historic Uluru Statement from the Heart, and he is one of the 20 members of the Senior Advisory Group set up in 2019 to help co-design the Indigenous voice to government. He is one of, if not the most, prominent advocates for the voice. Noel Pearson is a remarkable Australian and a highly respected Indigenous leader who we are truly privileged to hear from this evening, and we thank him for taking time in his very busy schedule to be with us. Noel Pearson.
Thank you very much for this very kind opportunity to address the Executive Council. I first came into the family of my Jewish friends in Melbourne more than 30 years ago. I entered into the friendship and family of the late Ron Caston, barrister in the Mabo case, and immediately upon the High Court's decision, I engaged Ron to help us draft a mainland claim for native title, which eventually became Wik Peoples versus the state of Queensland. I can say 30 years later that the remaining terrestrial native title claims on Cape York Peninsula, a region which I call home and which I have been prosecuting native title claims with my colleagues over the last 3 decades. They will come to an end within the next 2 years. We will have settled full land justice for our people in Cape York Peninsula, over 98% of the region, a region the size of the state of Victoria. So with Ron's great assistance from the very moment the High Court ruled in Mabo, we have been delivered, along with many other groups all across the continent, justice in respect of our traditional homelands. Very early in my friendship with Ron, who I realized only in retrospect had become a great tutor and mentor of mine. He was on the equivalent of the speed dial on my phone, and any time I would ring his chambers in Melbourne, he would pick up the phone and give me some advice on some matter of law and politics and business and so on. I completely miss Ron. I think of him often. He was like a de facto father to me and a great mentor. Ron then invited me, when I said to him that I was interested in undertaking articles. Ron then introduced me to Mark Liebler at Arnold Block Liebler, and I had the great opportunity to work at ABL under the tutelage of Mark and his partners there. Mark too became a mentor of mine, and with Ron's passing has been a real friend and an advisor to me over the last 3 decades. I've certainly enjoyed my relationship with ABL, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot about leadership from Mark, and quite frankly, my internship was more about power than the law. And one of the things that Ron had said to me very early on was the need for Indigenous leaders to pivot from the High Court decision and start to think about making agreements with Australian governments. And he particularly enjoined me to think about making common ground and finding common ground with political conservatives. And he felt that some of our gains were going to be susceptible to backlash and so on, and that we urgently needed to think about striking alliances with the decent conservative right of Australia. And we set about doing that when the furor of the Wick decision descended upon the country. So this was in 1997, 1998. And Ron's advice to me was that you will be surprised about the alliances that you could find if you engaged with decent figures from the business, legal, and political right of the country. And so it proved. Over those 2 years, I learned a massive lesson from a process that Ron advised us on, where we found a lot of common ground with decent conservatives. Alas, we were not able to secure a proper settlement of the 10-point plan proposed by the then Liberal government, led by John Howard. But nevertheless, I did learn an important political lesson from Ron, and I continued my association with Mark. He and I were talking about the opportunity of of working with the Conservative government in the early 2000s. We thought that the 2004 election, the re-election of the Conservative government, gave us an opportunity to approach Howard in his last term, that this could be an occasion, a time when the then Prime Minister might focus on constitutional recognition of Indigenous people. And Mark and I worked together between 2004 and 2007, which led to Prime Minister Howard actually kicking off this whole agenda of constitutional recognition of our people. Not many people remember that it was Howard that started this process on the eve of the 2007 election. And he gave a speech in Sydney to the Sydney Institute, and Mark and I, really, Mark advising me and he helping me with the advocacy, resulted in a speech where John Howard said this. He said this at the start of the 2007 federal election campaign. I believe we must find room in our national life to formally recognise the special status of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as the first peoples of our nation. We must recognise the distinctiveness of Indigenous identity and culture and the right of Indigenous people to preserve that heritage. The crisis of Indigenous social and cultural disintegration requires a stronger affirmation of Indigenous identity and culture as a source of dignity, self-esteem, and pride. And he went on to say, I sense that the Australian people want to move, and they want to move towards a new settlement of this issue. He said, I share that desire, which is why I'm here tonight. If I'm re-elected, I will put to the Australian people within 18 months a referendum to formally recognise Indigenous Australians in our Constitution, their history as the first inhabitants of our country, their unique heritage of culture and languages, and their special, though not separate, place within a reconciled, indivisible nation. Okay, so this entire agenda had its genesis in Prime Minister Howard's speech that night. Of course, he was not elected, and Labor entered power at the Commonwealth level, and that would last for 5 years. 2 years into that Labor reign, the then Prime Minister Julia Gillard set up a panel, an expert panel made of politicians, lawyers, and community representatives that was charged with exploring ideas for constitutional recognition. And Mark co-chaired that expert panel with Senator Dodson. Senator Dodson was not a senator at the time, but Mark and Patrick really spent a year-on consultations coming up with ideas for recognition. The principal idea that emerged was the guarantee against racial discrimination. A non-discrimination provision would be inserted into the Constitution to ensure equality. This was supported across the board, and the Australian people seemed to be supportive of it, so far as polling could determine. When the report was launched, there was a vigorous backlash and resistance to the idea of inserting a protection against racial discrimination in the Constitution. It really was a brick wall. And we were opposed by constitutional conservatives who argued that this would be an American-style one-clause Bill of Rights. And so we had to go back to the drawing board in the face of this pretty comprehensive resistance to the idea of a non-discrimination clause. And to identify that an alternative path forward, I went to see the constitutional conservatives at the Australian Catholic University in North Sydney. Those conservatives were led by Professor and Vice-Chancellor Greg Craven, and the head of the Menzies Institute at the time, Julian Leeser, prior to him becoming an MP. And Julian and his friend Damien Freeman and Greg Craven and myself and my colleague Shireen Morris sat down and we had a dialogue about the problem. And it was Julian and his colleagues who suggested that when we asked them, well, if you're not going to give us a protection against racial discrimination, how do Indigenous people ensure that when they have concerns about laws passed by Parliament, that they're not discriminatory and they're able to ensure that past discriminations are not repeated in the future? Well, the answer was, why don't you have a democratic say to the Parliament? Bang. That was the voice. That was the genesis of the voice. The genesis lay in a group of constitutional conservatives, two of whom were Jewish, and very anxious to work with us to find a way through this problem. And the genius of their idea was soon apparent to me. They had flipped the question. Rather than having a constitutional guarantee that would meet with resistance, why don't Indigenous people have a voice that they can express to the Parliament whenever they feel that the laws proposed by Parliament are repugnant in some way or not useful or that derogate from the rights of our people? We then wrote as a group together with Professor Marcia Langton. We wrote to the then Prime Minister Tony Abbott, telling him about the clause we had developed with the assistance of Professor Toomey from Sydney University. So the five of us signed a letter to Prime Minister Abbott committing to the idea of a constitutional voice. So the voice has its origins back in 2014. There was a certain drafting that we were comfortable with. But over the years since 2014, the language and the drafting has evolved, and it's quite different today from what it originally was. But what is consistent is the idea that a body would be established under the Constitution that would have the function of providing advice to the Parliament and the executive government, and that this body would not give rise to any justiciability in the courts, that it would be simply a guarantee of a democratic contribution by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Islander peoples, and the Parliament would not be obliged to follow that advice. The Parliament would listen, but the Parliament would not be bound to follow the advice. And so all of that process occurred over 5 parliaments. There have been 6 prime ministers and 5 parliaments that have dealt with this issue of constitutional recognition. Simply no other policy issue has involved such a long and considered process as this one. And supported by the Liberal National Party governments that went to elections in that 15-year period. There has been bipartisanship in relation to this right up until December last year. These last 9 years were governments led by the Liberal National Party, and the process kept developing and refining, and the major piece of work that was done in the last government of Scott Morrison was to develop a policy design for how the voice would work in practice and what future legislation might look like. And so here we are, very close to finally having a referendum this year, when all of a sudden the National Party decided they were not going to support the voice. And earlier this year, Peter Dutton decided to depart from bipartisanship. The only change that has happened is that there's been an election of a Labor government last May. That is the only explanation for why it is that the consensus has fallen apart. So we are going into this referendum without bipartisanship. However, there is a pathway to success. We need a majority of voters in a majority of the states. We have a solid yes vote as a foundation for success. There is a solid no vote, but in the middle is this undetermined number of people who are either soft yes or soft no or genuinely undecided. And the task of the campaign over the next 5 weeks plus is to get out and convince convince the soft yeses to turn into hard yeses, and to answer the questions, the real concerns and the real questions that the soft no's have, in order to convince them to come to yes. And those questions are real, and I have found after 7 weeks of relentless campaigning around the country, the same as my other colleagues who are doing the same thing, what we're finding is that when we have these conversations with Australians, we're able to turn a lot of people from soft no's to yes. They simply have a set of important questions they want answered. And the task of the campaign is to attend to those questions. Okay, I might leave it there and see if there are any such questions on the call this evening.
Thank you, Noel. Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Noel. That's a very valuable history, because it explains the genesis of the voice. One of the concerns with the original proposal about having a constitutional guarantee against racial discrimination was its justiciability, as you said.
Correct.
And the fear that it would lead to an endless stream of litigation.
Yeah.
And this voice proposal has been designed to make sure that that doesn't happen. So one of the questions, though, that has come up is that it's the general purpose of the voice and some uncertainty about its remit and what it will mean. This is a question that's come from Trevor and a number of others who are listening in tonight. You've gone around the country explaining what the voice is. is part of the difficulty that so much of the detail is still to be determined in the legislation itself.
Correct.
And what can you say, perhaps, to this audience about that issue, particularly about the remit and the possibility that it might touch on issues that do not specifically affect Indigenous people? Do you want us to put this up on the screen?
Have you got this?
Yes.
Yeah,
Lindsay.
okay. Well, that'd be useful if you could do that.
Thank you, Lindsay.
I carry around a little business card that actually has the 92 words of the constitutional alteration that we are voting on in October. And I urge everyone to have conversations about the actual words, not what people are presenting, as commentary around the referendum. The first starting place and the ending place is to actually have a look at the words of the alteration that we as Australians are going to vote for. Now, this is my analysis of the four main parts of those 92 words that we will vote on. The first part concerns recognition. And these are the words: in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. It's a real, could the people of Australia agree that those words are acceptable and are a proper recognition of the first peoples of Australia? So that's a real question, right? That Australians need to consider. Do those words meet with the expectations of Australians about an appropriate recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? The second part, in clause 1, is a guarantee. And the guarantee is from the people of Australia to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And that guarantee is that there shall be a body. There shall be a body to be called the voice. And that's an important promise. That's an important guarantee. The Australian people are telling Indigenous people that we guarantee that there shall be a body representing your people. And that body is guaranteed by the Constitution. It's not guaranteed by politicians. It's not guaranteed by the Parliament. It's not guaranteed by the government of the day. It is guaranteed by the people of Australia through this amendment to the Constitution. The third part of the clause, which is clause 2, deals with the purpose. What is the purpose of this voice? Well, the voice may make representations. And representations is democracy 101. Citizens, organizations, companies, environmental groups, lobby groups, they all make representations to Parliament and to government. This is the same species of representation. In other words, the Executive Council makes representations to Parliament and government. You are not guaranteed the Parliament will listen to you or the government will listen to you, but because you make persuasive arguments and because you're sensible in the way you present your arguments, you get listened to. But nothing's guaranteed in a democracy. You have to be smart, you have to be persuasive, and this is what the voice will need to be. It will need to make representations that are compelling and influential on the decision makers. It doesn't actually make laws. There's no changes to the way our democracy works. Our laws are made by the MPs that we elect. There's no change to the process. The voice cannot impede the parliament in its function. It can't slow down the parliament in its functions. It simply can only make representations. And the scope matter, Peter, is dealt with in this clause. It's the last clause, on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. That's the scope of the representations that may be made on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It's there in, well, I was going to say black and white, but it's actually in purple here. It's there in black and white. It's not about nuclear submarines. It's not about foreign affairs. It's about matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And finally, the question about the detail is actually dealt with in the last clause, 3. The Parliament shall have power to make laws. Everything concerning the detail of the voice is in the power of the Parliament. As it always is, the Constitution talks about taxation in about one word, and then we have 4,000 pages of legislation made by Parliament. Every subject in the Constitution constitutes a few words, and then the rest is done by Parliament. And Parliament has supreme power in relation to the laws that it makes. So it's extremely disingenuous for any politician to ask, where are the details? When in fact it will be their duty. It is their function to furnish the details. And it's not the government, actually. The words say the Parliament shall. The government can't furnish the details by itself. Ultimately, it needs to go through the House of Representatives and the Senate, and it concerns issues like the composition of the body, the functions of the voice, the powers of the voice, and the procedures of the voice. In other words, everything to do with the voice will be determined by Parliament.
And Noel, I assume that will include the test, if there is one, of what are matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples.
Absolutely. That will fall squarely under the functions and powers provisions. You know, the Parliament will have full control over defining what are the matters that, so you know, these lurid suggestions that we'll be asked, you know, we'll be providing advice on nuclear submarines and parking tickets and so on and so forth, that the No campaign have been pushing, are just completely aimed at creating a fear around this, when the plain words of the provision make it clear that it has to be matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Thank you. And just to make that clear, that there was a question from Dane about whether, you know, that could be challenged in the High Court. But I think if the Parliament makes an enactment which sets out the functions, the powers, the remit, and everything else as per these words, it would be, well, there might be one challenge, but I think it'd be fairly quickly dispensed with. Is that your view?
Correct. And, you know, I don't think there has been a provision of the Constitution that somebody hasn't tried something out on, and most of the far-fetched ones have been disposed of within one or two cases, and everybody's understood the law from there on.
Thank you. Now that's important. Look, another question has been that people can already, you know, citizens of Australia, whoever they are, can already make representations to Parliament. And as you correctly point out, The ECAJ does that on a regular basis for the Jewish community, and we don't always get listened to. Although I have to say that when our voice is listened to, we get better outcomes, not only for the Jewish community, but for the whole country. But let's put that to one side. How do you respond to the claim that is made on the no side that having a constitutionally guaranteed voice would permanently divide the country by having the First Nations people have a constitutionally guaranteed voice as compared to everybody else?
Well, we first need to accept that this does not change the Parliament. Parliament continues to be supreme. The Parliament is unimpeded by these representations. Secondly, there is a provision in the Constitution that underpins all federal lawmaking in respect of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and that is the race power. Now, I don't believe in the existence of race other than that we are members of the human race. So the race mention that's already in our Constitution is an outdated use of language. Nevertheless, it is in our Constitution, 5126. The Parliament has the power to make special laws about the people of any race. Now, that power is only exercised in relation to people of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin. In fact, that was the result of the 1967 referendum. We were originally absent from the Constitution. The federal Parliament had no power to legislate in respect of Indigenous Australians. We were only let into the Constitution in terms of the federal Parliament's power via this race power. It originally didn't apply to us because we were excluded from the Constitution. But it was put into the Constitution in 1901 in order to enable the federal Parliament to make laws in respect of Chinese people and South Sea Islanders, to control people the South Sea Islanders and Chinese who lived in Australia, to control their employment, to control what businesses they could get into, and so on. There was a real agenda. That was part of the White Australia policy. And in 1967, when we were finally let into the Constitution by 90% of the Australian voters at the time, we were let into the race category. That was the doorway that was open to us. The problem with being subject to the race power is that the Parliament does have the ability to make special laws about our people that could be discriminatory against us. That is a power that cannot be exercised in relation to any other group in Australia. It cannot be used in relation to the Jewish community or the Greek community or the Vietnamese Australian community or the Chinese community. It can only be exercised in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And you would think that if the Parliament has this special power to make laws in relation to Indigenous people, that at the very least, those Indigenous people should be able to tell the Parliament their views about those laws. And that is the justification for having a constitutional body that has a specific remit to advise the Parliament whenever it exercises a power under Section 5126.
It's a really important point, Noel. I don't think many people appreciate that the Australian Constitution already has in it, and has from day one, 123 years ago, a race power that initially excluded Indigenous people, and then after the 1967 referendum made it possible for the Parliament specifically to pass laws in relation to Indigenous peoples, but not necessarily for their benefit.
Correct.
And that is why, and that there was a High Court case on that, and that is
Correct.
why
Absolutely.
a constitutionally guaranteed voice is sought to counterbalance that.
Correct.
It's a point I haven't heard expressed so clearly before, but thank you for explaining it. One other question that's come up is also that the voice. What reason is there to suggest that the voice will be any more effective than past and existing advisory bodies in closing the gap in life expectancy, infant mortality rates, levels of educational attainment, health and well-being, incarceration rates, and so on? I guess there are no guarantees in life, but what reasons are there for believing that a constitutionally guaranteed voice will be more successful than its predecessors?
Well, by definition, a serious agenda to close the gap on disparity is a multi-generational challenge. In Cape York Peninsula, the life expectancy is 51 for women and 49 for men. The overall national numbers are better than that, but I can tell you when it comes to remote communities, the numbers are as bad as Cape York. Remote community life expectancy today is down in the early 50s and late 40s. You'd have to go to sub-Saharan Africa to find numbers like that. And if you're going to lift a life expectancy from 50 up to the Australian average, that is a multi-generational challenge. We've got to give ourselves 10, 20, 30 years to close the gap on life expectancy. And we're going to have to be effective. We're going to have good programs, good support. We're going to have to rebuild families, rebuild communities. We're going to have to get people out of poverty. Those are big challenges for us. And what you can't have is an advisory body that lasts for one term of Parliament and then scrapped. An advisory body that exists for 5 years and all of a sudden is gone. Tony Abbott set up an advisory committee with Warren Mundine as its chair. It didn't last into the next Liberal government. There wasn't even a change of political party when the thing was scrapped. So these advisory bodies are just, they're ephemeral. They exist according to the pleasure of the government of the day, whereas we need consistent advice over an extended period of time, over the generations. I'll tell you one example, Peter, rheumatic heart disease of children. A mild fever of a toddler or baby results in a compromised heart, which is incurable. Once you get rheumatic heart disease, your problem with your heart is incurable and you're susceptible to dying in your teens, in your 20s, or in your 30s. And the problem is rife across remote communities. I Googled, or got my staff to Google, whether our local member, who's been our local member for 26 years in Cape York and the Torres Strait, whether he had ever given a speech on the subject of rheumatic heart disease. And in 26 years, he had not uttered one word. Not uttered one word. He represents Torres Strait Islanders and Aboriginal people. They are 30% of his constituents, and yet he never uttered one word. He only spoke about it 2 weeks ago after I had raised this issue. So this is the function of the voice. It has to bring issues like rheumatic heart disease to the forefront, to the attention of the parliament and the government, and to be relentless about it, because we need attention to these problems. And so it is, as someone whose day job, my day job is education, health, welfare, poverty, all of these social and economic issues, employment, violence, incarceration, all of these problems, I can tell you as somebody who works in these stony fields, as I have done for 30 years, I can tell you the voice is absolutely critical for us to make progress on this. Absolutely critical. You've got to trust Indigenous leaders like myself when we say that. Australians seem to have strong opinions about what works and what doesn't work, when they have very little idea of actually what is happening on the ground and what is desperately needed. You have to trust Indigenous people that when we say that this reform, having a voice, it's not a radical idea. It's in fact a very modest idea, but having this voice will be crucial for us to close the gap.
You might just add one point, Noel, about just the dramatic difference in life expectancy. I don't think it's widely understood just how wide that gap is. Not just a question of a few years. We're talking, decades in some cases. It's a very wide gap, and even white people. I mean, white people who live in very remote locations, where there are few services. Maybe they have a year or two lower life expectancy, but nothing as dramatic as with Indigenous people. Perhaps you could just give us some data on that.
The statistics, when you aggregate the entire Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population that live in cities where there are good medical services and so on, the national statistics are between 8 and 10 years, the difference. When you go to remote communities, you're talking 30 years. That is how large the gap is. And yet, I can testify that I lived in a community not so long ago where I had 2 grandmothers lived to 101. This life expectancy collapse has happened in the last 50 years, whereas people born in the bush regularly lived to their 80s. We had elders in their 90s. As I say, I had 2 grandmothers lived to 101. This was normal across remote communities that I knew as a child. But there has been this very dramatic collapse caused by diabetes, caused by substance abuse, and caused by diseases like rheumatic heart disease that we could eradicate. It's been eradicated in many jurisdictions around the world. It's just that we do not have a concerted campaign here in Australia to tackle the driving causes of rheumatic heart disease, and that's why so many of our people are falling victim to it.
Noel, we could go on for much, much longer, but we're getting towards the end of our time, and I know you have a hard deadline of 7 p.m. Because you have to be somewhere else. So I think we've captured all of the questions that just about all of the questions that people have texted to me. I've been trying my best to group them together. But I think you've answered all the main claims that have been put forward by the no side, as well as made the case for the yes side. It's now over to the people to make the decision, and we pray that they'll be guided by reason and not emotion, and not anything other than the facts. So I'll hand back to Robert now to conclude, and I want to offer you my personal thanks for the time you've taken and for the explanation you've given.
And Peter, thank you very much for your support over the decades. And I really want to underline to you, to your committee or your council, that we just simply wouldn't be here without Mark and without Ron and without Julian. They have been so helpful and for us to, well, not just native title. Native title will stand as a testament to Ron Caston's great abilities and great service to our people. This issue, as I said, Julian has been really my dialogue partner in the development of the concept of the voice, and Mark has certainly been the great facilitator of this process over a long period of time. He's really been not just a personal mentor, but a real support to my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander fellow leaders across the country. And I just think I just enjoin your council and your community to help us in this next 5+ weeks, so that we get the kind of outcome that will push Australia forward and reconcile the First Peoples with the rest of the country. It is so desperately important.
I'll just make one very quick final comment before I hand to Robert. For some of us, not all of us, but speaking for myself, it's a debt of honour that we feel that we owe, particularly to the memory of William Cooper, but also to our own history.
For sure.
That's all I'll say.
Thank you.
Thank you, Noel. I'm sure that everyone who's on this webinar will join me in thanking you again for giving up your time, being with us, and most importantly, for the masterful exposition of the issues and your responses to the questions, which are the key questions. And I can only repeat that which Peter has said. I can't talk, of course, on behalf of the Australian Jewish community, but personally, it is a debt of honour, and we wish you every success in the next 5 weeks. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Robert.